Hello everybody, we'll just leave it for a few moments to allow everybody to join, but this is the Town and Country Planning Association webinar, Homes and Neighbourhoods for Children and Young People, and we will begin shortly. So my name is Gemma Hyde. I am a Projects and Policy Manager at the Town and Country Planning Association, working on healthier placemaking, and I'm going to be chairing this session. So today's webinar is about homes and neighbourhoods for children and young people, and it's only possible for this event to be free because we have the support of Sport England for this work, and we're very grateful that they continue to support us to do healthier placemaking work and support local authorities to embed health and wellbeing into local planning policy. Next slide, please. So the Town and Country Planning Association, we're a charity with the vision of homes, places and communities in which everyone can thrive. And it's our mission to challenge, inspire and support people to create healthy, sustainable and resilient places that are fair for everybody. So our work covers new communities, new garden communities, work around healthy homes and healthy neighbourhoods, climate change and community participation and community justice. Our website is a really great resource across all of these topics if you've not visited it before, and you can find it at tcpa.org.uk. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, our speaker from Clarion Housing Group is actually unable to join us at late notice this afternoon. So we do have plenty to cover, and we'll have a great opportunity for a time for question and answers with our other presenters after they've spoken. So please, throughout the webinar, you can use the questions box at the bottom of your screen to leave questions for our speakers, and we will attempt to cover as many as we can. The webinar is being recorded and it will be hosted on our website a few days after we've completed the session today. Next slide, please. So today's webinar is actually the 9th in a series that the TCPA have been running on healthy placemaking and 20-minute neighbourhoods since around 2020. When we talk about 20-minute neighbourhoods, what we mean is complete, compact and connected communities. So places that allow people to live locally more of the time. And there are many benefits to doing that. There are benefits for people's health and well-being, benefits to the community and social value. There are benefits to the climate, and there are benefits to different demographics within the community as well, including children and young people. So the way that places are planned and designed, built and managed has a significant influence over whether communities are able to live healthy lives. For around the last 10 years, the TCPA have supported local authorities and communities to create healthier places through guidance, policy and workshops. And as I mentioned before, our website is a really great resource and provides free access to all of these things, including our guide to 20-minute neighbourhoods, which is aimed at local authorities and those working in local authorities, and then also our neighbourhood planning version, which we published last year. So I'd really encourage you to go and check that out. Next slide, please. In addition, the TCPA is also a partner of the Voice Opportunity Power Toolkit, which is a youth engagement toolkit developed with Sport England, ZCD Architects and Grosvenor. So the toolkit, again, is a free resource that has practical guidance on how to involve young people, ages sort of 11 to 18, in the way that places get built and managed. So it's aimed at professionals working with young people rather than young people themselves. So you might be a developer, a designer, a planner, or even somebody like a sports provider. And it's designed to improve participation in, and crucially, the quality of new development and regeneration schemes. So it has its own website, which is voiceopportunitypower.com. And part of our work around children and young people in the coming 6 months and this year is to actually make sure that this toolkit is updated, and we are in the process of doing that, and we'll be launching a new version shortly. Next slide, please. And we're also really pleased to announce that on the 18th of June, we're running a free one-day conference in Birmingham to explore further the relationship between children, young people and the built environment. and the critical importance of creating healthy places in which they can thrive. So the day will highlight case studies from place-based practice in local authority areas and also the private sector. We have confirmed speakers, including Anne Longfield, who's the former Children's Commissioner and Chair of the Commission on Young Lives, Tim Gill, who's the author of Urban Playground and an independent researcher and expert on children's and child-friendly approaches. Speakers from the Child Friendly Leads programme, from the Youth Engagement Service at Greater Cambridge Shared Planning, as well as place efficiency experts, ludicology, and contributions from one of the large housing developers, Urban and Civic. So there are limited tickets still available for the conference, and full details are available on our events page on our website. If you're unable to attend, we do intend to record the conference and find ways to share it with as many people as possible. And this won't be the last event that we do around children and young people. It's very much the beginning of a piece of work for us. So do follow us on social media or via our newsletter to keep in touch with our plans. And at the end of the session, there'll be links to the newsletter and to our social media on Twitter or X and LinkedIn. Next slide, please. So it is with great pleasure that I can introduce Professor Peter Craftel. Peter is a Professor of Human Geography at the University of Birmingham. His research focuses on children and young people's interactions with their environments, from their participation in sustainable urban design to their experiences of environmental change and pollution. He also researches education spaces, focusing on school design and alternative informal and outdoor settings. He has published 10 books and over 100 journal articles on these topics and has led over 30 funded projects. With his colleague, Sophie Hadfield Hill, apologies, Peter, his research about children's experiences of living in newly built urban places, such as garden communities, has informed the work of many local authorities, national agencies such as Homes England, and international organisations like UN Habitat, UNICEF, and UNESCO. He is a fellow of both the Academy of Social Sciences and the Royal Society of Arts. Peter has let us know that he may have to disappear unexpectedly just for a minute to allow somebody into his home for a very important project. So if that happens, we will manage it. But Peter, I will hand it over to you.
Thanks so much, Gemma, and also to Sally for inviting me and for organising today's event. I'm really delighted to be able to talk about some of our work and more broadly to kind of make the case for why the built environment matters for children and young people. I know that for some of you, some of this will be familiar, perhaps all of it will be familiar. For others, certain aspects might be novel, but I hope to offer some questions, some provocations, some points for debate, and also action through the talk. As Gemma mentioned, this is very much joint work with Sophie Hadfield Hill, my colleague at the University of Birmingham, and a wider team, research that we've been doing with children and young people, particularly in large-scale master-planned new urban places for the last 15 plus years. What I'd like to do is to give a kind of broad overview, almost a global overview of this question of why the built environment matters for children and young people, before zooming in on some of the findings from our research. I'll do that thematically. Usually when I present our work, I do draw directly on the voices of children and young people, because that's a really important aspect of our work. But today I want to focus on key messages around this question of why and how the built environment matters for children and young people. Next slide, please, Sally. So starting with some of I guess the fundaments of both the research that I do and the advocacy work that we do around children and young people, and the broader case for planning for children and young people. The first is this fundamental observation that children are individuals with rights. Under, for instance, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, children and young people have a range of rights that are linked with the built environment. Most notably, and perhaps best known, their right to rest, play, leisure, and recreation. Secondly, however, children are dependent beings. They are dependent on the decisions that adults make for them, the actions that we as adults take, and also the ways in which many cities have been planned with adults and specific adults very often in mind. And so we would argue that the actions and in some cases the inactions of city governments, of other authorities and professionals, arguably affect children more than any other group. And by extension, there's a whole series of other issues that affect children here, from their physical size and vulnerability, their vulnerability to a range of health issues, environmental determinants of health, and the kinds of rights and that children have compared with adults. On that point, children's views are rarely heard. Things have improved in many contexts, and as many of you will know, and as is part of the rationale for this workshop today, there has been increasing interest in children and young people's views. And it'll be great to hear Anna and Jenny's talk after this one around different approaches to kind of co-creating plans for working with children and young people. But there's still much to do. And this is also vital because the healthy development of children and their inclusion in processes like planning is critical to the future well-being of cities and indeed of humans. Next slide, please. Another way to look at this is really neatly encapsulated by UNICEF in terms of what they call the urban paradox. So on the one hand, and here they're thinking particularly of environmental health and environmental conditions. As you can see at the top of the slide there, cities do have a potential urban advantage, particularly for children and young people. They tend to have, in many contexts globally, access to cleaner water, better sanitation, education services, immunisation, and a whole range of other services and resources. And I know I'm making a kind of broad and sweeping statement here. At the same time, achieving net zero or similar goals in just 16 cities could, if we take advantage of that urban advantage, prevent up to 65,000 adverse birth outcomes per year just in those cities. However, there are huge inequalities, meaning huge disparities in accessing the urban advantage. These are both generational, for the reasons that I've just outlined in terms of children's rights, but they also cut across, they're intersectional. So certain young people in particular parts of cities may experience different inequalities. There may be inequalities in terms of ethnicity, social class, gender, disability, and so on. Hence this urban paradox where cities could, perhaps should be, a better place for children to live, but aren't always for all groups. Next slide, please. But the other thing that I want to emphasize here is that we shouldn't just approach children and young people from some kind of deficit model. We know already through research that we've done, through research across the social sciences and more widely, that children make huge contributions to the life of cities and should be involved in the planning of those cities because of the contributions that they make through what we call their agency. Very briefly, that could be through their learning, through their schooling, and what they can then transfer to adults in a kind of intergenerational process of learning. It could be through their work, whether paid or voluntary. It could be through their socialization and play, and that's something I'll come back to a little later, the ways in which the very presence of children socializing, playing, hanging out is very much a part of the vibrancy of cities. And finally, as we've come to see, particularly in the last 10 years, around children and young people's environmental action, behaviours, values, and their activism, particularly in public spaces in cities. Next slide, please. So with some of those broad reasons in mind for why we should focus on children and young people and why we should include children and young people in planning, I'd like to sort of hone in a little bit on some of our research from particularly the UK, from India, and also Brazil. I'll, in a moment, talk through a range of themes to give you a sense of some of the kind of key findings from our research in terms of children and young people's experiences of living, particularly in master planned new urban places. But I'll also do that again to just emphasize a whole suite of reasons for why we should consider children and young people in the planning of the built environment. Now, I've included this slide, not really to talk about in any great detail, but just to give a flavour of the kinds of methods that we use in our research. And I'd be really happy to talk more about those methods during the discussion later. Also, just to note, and this I think will add to the kinds of resources that Gemma was talking about earlier, the Voice Opportunity Power Toolkit, also to Anna and Jenny's talk, that these are methods that we've also used in participatory work with children and young people, with local authorities and a range of other actors. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, I'd like to talk through 5 by no means exhaustive themes for both why and how the built environment matters for children and young people. I would like to draw out some of the positives, particularly focusing on our research from newly built urban places in England over the last 10 to 15 years, as well as some key challenges. So trying to draw out both the positive and kind of more challenging experiences will, I hope, address this question. I think probably some of these themes are more familiar. Certainly there's been lots of attention to mobility, which I'll talk about first, and children's play, which I'll talk about last. Perhaps the 3 themes in the middle may be more or less familiar to some, depending on your background. Next slide, please. So what I'll do is, as I talk through is I've included quite a lot of detail on the slide just about the points that I'll talk about. I won't necessarily talk about all of them for the purposes of time, but they're there so that if people want to sort of follow up specific points, we can. And I'm also very happy to share these slides afterwards if that's of interest. So the first thing to say is that in many of the new communities that we worked in England, we found that levels of mobility were actually fairly high. Now, that's not to say that children's spatial range in terms of distance from their homes was necessarily particularly high, because as a lot of research has shown, that's declined over the last couple of generations. But within these places, young people were very mobile. They spent a lot of time just walking around their communities, and indeed that's something that we've written about. And therefore actually had a wealth of knowledge, we would argue much better than adults, and also ideas about which elements of street design worked and which needed improving. So we always say that one of the kind of key reasons for focusing on children and young people is that they simply spend more time hanging out and playing and moving through urban spaces, and therefore a really key community to consult when it comes to their planning. However, as some of you may be familiar with, in these new spaces, there were various attempts to create shared surfaces, kind of home zone style spaces, where the difference between the road and the pavement was not particularly clear. Of course, this is a deliberate design intervention designed to prioritise pedestrians and cyclists. But despite children and young people feeling overwhelmingly safe, there were anxieties about the safety of these shared surfaces, both amongst parents and carers and children themselves. And this often came down to the actual use and uptake of these spaces. Despite these design measures, sightlines and surfaces were often blocked by cars and construction traffic. Many drivers were speeding or driving far too fast through these streets, and there were many examples of kind of problematic moments where children encountered cars and drivers behaving inappropriately. So in terms of mobility, actually, one of the things that we've called for in the past is further information, even training about how these street environments actually work. Beyond that, though, we also found that in some new communities, connectivity was limited, both within communities where, for instance, there were incomplete footpaths or cycle tracks, and between older and newer communities. One example in Northamptonshire was of only one pedestrian routeway between 2 large housing estates and a 10-foot high wall that had been built between the 2 communities, leading not only to a lack of connectivity, but feelings of isolation and indeed tensions between the 2 communities. So it goes without saying that the design of the urban environment, of course, in complex interplay with a range of other factors, can both support and hinder walking activity and other forms of physical activity. Next slide, please. A second feature that we were interested in, and this is particularly given the context of our work from the late 2000s into the 2010s, was sustainable urban design. And here again, we encountered a range of both positive and more challenging issues. Firstly, we found that children and young people were very aware of various eco-design features in their communities, although didn't necessarily have accurate information about them. And for them, they were an important source of curiosity, pride, and local identity. So it was interesting for us how these forms of sustainable design were not only interesting in a technical, environmental sense, but also fostered a sense of belonging and pride for young people in their community. So these eco-designs facilitated community learning about environmental issues. Although those kinds of opportunities weren't always necessarily taken up, whether in the school, whether in the community, or whether in families. There were, however, and perhaps as a result, also a range of negative perceptions based on misconceptions and urban myths. So, for instance, that there were rats in some of the sustainable urban drainage systems in some communities, that animals, birds, even robbers could somehow get through photovoltaic panels. And a whole series of other myths which had been promulgated within the communities, and which, in many cases, actually in the end led, despite a kind of feeling of pride, to forms of resistance to more eco-friendly, perhaps more radical forms of housing design, which reflected norms about traditional house styles and streetscapes. So we thought, and we still think, there's more to be done about the actual design of eco-friendly housing and buildings in general, and the ways in which that might facilitate greater uptake and understanding. Next slide, please. Importantly, young people wanted to be more involved in sustainable planning and design, but partly because of their presence in the community, although they knew a lot about what was going on, they felt there was a lack of information about the features in their community. And they were often disillusioned by practical problems with sustainable design, delays and malfunctions, a wind turbine being built but not turned on for a year, and a whole range of other issues with the sustainable aspects of the design. So what we're saying here is really that there are missed opportunities both within homes and also in the wider urban environment to both facilitate more eco-friendly practices and to capitalise on these environments to promote environmental learning, environmentally relevant behaviours, and a sense in which sustainable urban design can be a key part of community life. Next slide, please. Thirdly, a third issue that we explored with children and young people in our research was community relations. And here, one of the things that we've been arguing is that even in new communities, bringing in a sense of the history of the land on which a place has been built is really important in planning new urban spaces. And I'm aware of a range of developers and local authorities that are really doing that, particularly through some of the work that we've been doing with local authorities involved in the Garden Communities agenda, drawing on kind of heritage aspects, archaeological aspects, and then drawing those into community development work with children and young people to provide a sense of belonging and a sense of identity of that place for the future can be really successful. But there were also, more pragmatically, a range of challenges associated with living in a place in the making. Isolation that I've mentioned already, a lack of facilities with this problem still, that some services had not been introduced at a fairly early stage of the build of a new community. And many young people described how they didn't feel a part of their community. So some familiar problems that we've identified in research in other places, in other urban places, of children being moved on by adults, them feeling there's nothing for them, which I'll come back to when I talk about play a little later on. We also found that children and young people were both acutely aware of and involved in community tensions, which extended beyond children and young people and the generations. There was a divide between the older and newer communities, which I've mentioned already. Also divisions between residents in certain areas, but particularly between owner-occupied and housing association housing, where there were some obvious markers of difference in some places. And finally, tensions between adults and young people regarding the ambiguity of the design of some places. particularly small patches of grass that had been built into new communities where it wasn't really clear who owned them, whether it was the local authority who should be owning and maintaining them, whether they were communally owned, whether they were owned by particular residents. And this led to a range of ongoing tensions because of the illegibility of the urban environment for children. Children playing and being told to move on because these were private spaces, even though they weren't necessarily private spaces. Next slide, please. Just to say something very briefly about education, I mentioned the provision of services and resources for communities earlier. It's our argument, and I don't think it's a terribly contentious one, that education provision should be at the heart of any urban transformation strategy. In some of the communities we've worked in where the school has been in place first, this not only facilitated our research, but also facilitated the kinds of community learning, community cohesion, and wider kind of intergenerational interactions that can be so positive when a place is emerging. And young people's educational futures should, depending on the size of a settlement, of course, be mapped in the planning of new urban spaces, thinking about access and mobility, but also thinking beyond schools specifically in terms of providing education, thinking about partnerships with local voluntary organisations or education providers to facilitate community building opportunities. Next slide, please. Finally, in terms of play, in some of these new communities that we worked in England, young people were generally positive about the formal provision of playgrounds and also of green spaces and natural areas. So there was much that was working, and I'm happy to talk about some of the specifics and specific communities we worked in if that's of interest. But as is a familiar story, older young people were generally dissatisfied with opportunities for play and for more generally for recreation and leisure. As is often the case, the playgrounds were designed principally with younger children in mind. I've already mentioned how open spaces and wooded areas were those sites of ongoing tension because of this kind of lack of legibility, with questions about the ownership of land and the ways in which children and young people should be accessing them. To the extent that in some communities, young people actually chose to move themselves on simply because they thought that they were going to get moved on by adults, so kind of preempting that as they moved around their communities. And finally, avoiding privatising play, and this comes from our research not only in the UK but also in India, in new communities, and making play spaces accessible and available to all is of course a priority, alongside safe and easy access to good quality play provision. Next slide, please. So that's really all I'd like to say today, both in terms of the broader, if you like, more global messages in terms of why children and young people should be included in the planning of urban places and why we should consider them as a central and important group when we're planning places. I'm of course really happy to discuss some of the further details of that in today's session, but we also have a range of research outputs from books to journal articles, reports and toolkits which are available, which I'm more than happy to share. Next slide, please. I also wanted to flag that, as Gemma mentioned, we've been working with a range of organisations, including Homes England. We've worked with the RTPI previously, and also with several local authorities in terms of involving children and young people in planning and ensuring that children and young people's needs are adequately included in a range of different settings. So if it's of interest to you, there's a range of things that we can provide based on our research, from feedback on master plans to recommendations about specific contexts and sites, to active discussions and training about the involvement of young people. And that last one, perhaps all of those, of course, in combination with many other groups who are increasingly doing this kind of work, as we've already heard and will hear today. So please do reach out and get in touch with myself and Sophie. Thanks for listening and looking forward to the discussion later in the session.
Great, thanks Peter, thanks very much. So we're getting some questions in, so please do continue to put questions in the questions box at the bottom of your screen, and we will come to those and pick up on some of the things that have already gone in, and some specific examples as well, hopefully. So we'll do our next session, which is with Anna Gaffney and Jenny Wood from A Place in Childhood. So Anna is a town planner who's worked in a variety of roles across development management and policy in the Scottish town planning system. She has an in-depth knowledge of town planning systems with a focus on local development plans, environmental policy and regulation, energy generation and transmission, and cultural heritage. She was a founding board member of A Place in Childhood before joining the team as a projects and policy manager in 2023. Anna is currently leading the Children and Teenagers Neighbourhood Plan project, focusing on phase 2 of the project, which seeks to work with children and teenagers and key stakeholders to make actions identified in the plans happen. Jenny is a town planner as well and completed a PhD on children's human rights and the Scottish town planning system in 2016. She then co-founded A Place in Childhood in 2018 and leads a variety of child and youth-centred projects through A Place in Childhood, including youth panels, participatory action research and plan co-creation. She also has a background in academic research, including nationwide studies on poverty, destitution and homelessness across the UK. A Place in Childhood combines both a practical focus on action and academic level rigour on any topic that relates to children and their rights. I believe over to Anna.
Oh, I think it's over to Jenny first.
Oh, sorry.
Hello. Thank you so much, Gemma and Sally, for organising all of this. It's a real pleasure to be speaking to you this afternoon. And what me and Anna are going to be speaking about is a lot of our work about co-creating plans with children and young people. And this is something that we've been kind of honing for the last kind of 5 years of existing, and something that we've really delved down into on the project that Anna is leading, that we just heard a bit about and we'll hear more about as we go on today. So this is going to be really focused on the methods of involving children and young people, but of course we'd be happy to hear questions later on about the kinds of things children and young people bring up. So next slide, please. So just as a bit of background into what we do at A Place in Childhood, we essentially exist to bring children's rights into the service systems, policies that have an impact on them. So we always put children at the centre of what the systems around them are doing. And our idea is to change the systems around the children rather than changing the children to fit the system. So we do kind of a range of different projects on anything where we can look at how we can build children's rights as based on the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child kind of into the way that we do business as usual in Scotland and also the rest of the UK. I'm just going to hand over to Anna just now to explain a bit about the project that this is mostly based on. So next slide, please.
Thanks, Jenny. Yes, so we've been working on a project over the last year, which has been refining our methodology for co-creating plans for children and young people. The project is creatively called the Children and Teenagers Neighbourhood Plans Project. I'm just going to provide a little bit of background. The project was match funded by the charity Paths for All, which seeks to improve active travel opportunities for communities to reduce trips by private vehicles, and 5 local authorities across Scotland, plus some additional partners. The aim of the project was to create 5 neighbourhood plans with children and teenagers in different place contexts across Scotland to better understand what they need from their places and identify opportunities to deliver these via some plans for action. So you can see on the map on the right that there was 5 areas that we wanted to work in, and we wanted a diversity of place as well. So we have a remote rural context in the west side of Shetland, 2 rural town contexts in Inverurie in Aberdeenshire and Jedburgh in the Borders, a larger town in Bainsford and Langley's in Falkirk, and a city context in the neighbourhood of Craigmillar in Edinburgh. We spent between 2 and 3 days in each school across each neighbourhood and in schools across each of the neighbourhoods and to develop the plans for each place. And we worked with about 300 children and teenagers across about 13 schools in total. Next slide, please. Yeah, and we just wanted to kind of showcase our partners just here. So as you can see, we worked with 5 authorities like Edinburgh City Council, Aberdeenshire, Scottish Borders, Falkirk and Shetland Islands Council. We also worked, several of the councils partnered with another organisation. So for Edinburgh, for example, they worked closely with NHS Lothian on this project. They were keen to understand the health choices made by children and young people in their everyday lives as part of their ongoing healthy habits programs they had running in the Craigmillar neighbourhood. And in Aberdeenshire, we also worked alongside the organisation Aberdeen for a Fairer World as part of a project expansion to create just transition projects from the neighbourhood plans created by the children and teenagers in the area. And these explored kind of local climate adaptation measures. With regards to Falkirk, Shetland and the Borders as well, whilst we worked directly with the council on the children and teenagers plans, there were lots of other organisations that were involved as stakeholders as well. They just weren't funding partners. I'm just going to pass you back over to Jenny to kind of give you an overview of the process that we undertook. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Anna. So what we're going to talk through today is kind of the stages of the plan co-creation process. So I'm just going to give a bit of an overview of these now, and we split it up into core phases, which really create like a nice baseline plan with children and young people. But then there's also supplementary phases that really kind of add levels of detail. They don't all have to be done. You might kind of pick and choose from the supplementary phases. And we'll talk through why you might want to pick different ones depending on the kind of framing of your project and the amount of time you have. But the core phases are essentially 3 different things. So the kind of big focus that we start off with is really looking at our place right now. So it's about the present of their place. And we do something called experiential mapping, which we'll talk through next to kind of think about what's good and what could be better. And then the next core thing we do is to think about the future of our place. So we use like a thought experiment that helps us to think about a 20-minute neighbourhood. So we think about their place as an island and we think about what it would need to kind of survive and to thrive. And that helps us to really kind of think about the future and think about self-sufficiency a bit more. And then from all of this, we kind of devise shared priorities for action with the children and young people. And the idea is that they can tell us anything that they think is relevant to their place. We don't try to shut them down to specific things, because this means that actually it's useful for a wide range of factors, and it really keeps it centered in their right to participate in the matters that affect them and to really kind of have that freedom of expression to show us what they really want to convey, not just necessarily what we as adults might want to hear from them. So once we've done that, we have this draft co-created plan. And what we would always do is send that back to the participants to check it and sign it off. We'd basically ask, is there anything we've missed or we've misunderstood? And from that, we'd have a finalized co-created plan. With these supplementary phases, these add some extra detail. So for instance, developing our local projects is a way to take their priorities for action to kind of delve a bit deeper into what, were really the top priorities of things they'd want to do and how they might want to be involved with that. Consulting on our plan is a really powerful step if you have the time and like the school or the youth group is interested in doing this. It's actually supporting the young people to consult other peers in their school on what they think of the plan. So at the end, we actually have a shared plan for not just the children and young people we initially worked with, but actually potentially up to everyone in the school. And then the final one is showcasing our plans. So this is holding a stakeholder engagement event where the children and young people get to share what they've created with the people that might be able to support in making it happen. And that really helps us to have an intergenerational dialogue and also help support young people to understand how change happens and maybe why change can't always happen or why it takes a long time. So altogether, this is kind of all of the phases that you might do to co-create a plan. Next slide, please. So the idea as well in doing all of this work is that we kind of integrate the idea of legacy into it. So what we want to do in creating this kind of broad level plan is create something that means you don't have to keep going back to ask little bits of information. You've actually got a really good and thorough plan that you could base lots of things off. And it's really centered on what the children and young people want to explore. And so, this diagram shows the various different ways you might think about legacy, and all of the areas we worked in on this project had slightly different things they wanted to get out of it, but it might be about aligning with other plans, policies and actions, like a local development plan, an open space strategy, or a place efficiency assessment. And these have just come in Scotland, so that's a really fantastic opportunity to put some of this information into that. There's also potentially delving deeper to understand next steps. So something we're going to start doing based on things that we've been told is co-design new public spaces and co-design community events that the children and young people wanted to see. And we're also looking at how we can link that kind of thing with the school curricula. And some of the schools we worked with could see this as a really good opportunity for project-based learning. We have something in Scotland called Learning for Sustainability, so it fits really well with that. There's also things like taking direct action. So maybe the group wants to go out on a litter pick, based on, you know, identifying litter as a big issue. And there's also some things that we can look at around strategies for ongoing communication. So that might be in some places that there's like a project steering group that's going to take forward the children and young people's plan. So these are all just different ways that the legacy could unfold from doing kind of the one plan. That is something we were thinking about through the process. So I'm just going to hand back over to Anna to speak about how we did that. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Jenny. So I'm going to provide a quick overview of the experimental mapping methodology we used to co-create the plans. We used this methodology in a school setting when we did this. So that's what I'm kind of referring to when I describe it. It would typically fit into a normal school day. However, it can be flexed to suit different settings and contexts, so that shouldn't be a constraint. The method also normally takes on average 1 full school day to complete or 2 half days. Next slide, please. So we always begin our day with the children and young people by asking them about what the important places are in their local area from their perspective. So this includes like both good and bad things, and we get them to plot this on a large A0 map. This begins a conversation with them about their place and allows them to reflect on what the key places are in their area. Sometimes as a way to start the conversation, we might ask them to imagine if Jenny and I were joining their school and what they might consider to be important to show us about the place. And from all this information, then we design a tour of the area, which we then go on. We typically try to connect as many of the important places that they've identified as possible and go out on the tour for about 90 minutes to 2 hours. We provide the children and young people with digital cameras as well to allow them to take photos of what we see. And this also allows everyone to have kind of a relaxed conversation about what they like and don't like about their neighbourhoods and places, what they would change, and also how they move around. There's a lot of storytelling and a lot of opinions about things. We learn a lot, and the facilitators, or Jenny and I, are taking loads and loads of notes. But it's a really good opportunity to hold space for the children and young people and hear what they think. Next slide, please. We then return to the school and start the map making process. So on the left here, you can see quite a busy map. And this is because we review the tour that we took with the children and young people. So we basically retrace our steps. We also ask them to talk about the photos that they've taken on digital camera, usually saying which one was the most important. And that also helps Jenny and I create the final map later on. So yeah, we retrace our steps and talk about what we've seen on the tour, making sure that what we've heard and we've gotten it right from their perspective. And again, Jenny and I are just writing up more notes from what we hear and the discussions that we're having. And this provides an opportunity for us to cover anything that we might have missed on the walk, or some we didn't get a chance to speak to some groups on the walk. And it also allows us to begin to identify key themes and ideas for potential priorities for the children and young people in their place. For example, it might be issues particularly in litter, or any areas that they feel especially unsafe, or inadequate play equipment, busyness of roads, and also other more positive aspects like the importance of nature, how important their cultural heritage is in their area, areas that they do enjoy hanging out. These exercises usually all take us till around lunchtime, and that's when usually everyone's quite tired and very much in need of a break. But at this point, this is when the facilitators, or Jenny and I, review the notes and begin drafting a set of key priorities for action for the afternoon session. And then after lunch, we would show the children and young people these priorities and establish that they're accurate and reflect their views, as we discussed in the morning. And then we move on to the next task of the day, which is finalising our plan. Next slide, please. And we can move on to the next slide as well, please. Thank you. So this is our thought experiment task. So we call this the island mapping task. And this is where we ask the children and young people to imagine that their neighbourhood or place has become an island and it is cut off from the surrounding area. And we ask them to consider what they would need in their neighbourhood or island place to survive and thrive as a community. We provide them with large A4 pieces of paper, as you can see on the left here. and lots of coloured pens, sometimes arts and craft materials. And we ask them to draw or list or communicate in whatever they feel comfortable with, what they think their places would need to be self-sufficient, both to survive and thrive, as I said. This is a super playful task, and we really support and encourage the young people to have really creative ideas. They usually really enjoy this task, and we found that the younger pupils tend to thrive in it a lot more than the older ones, which is really interesting. But yeah, they can usually come up with some pretty outlandish ideas, but that's also really helpful because from those kind of bigger ideas, we can work backwards with them to kind of see what the underlying themes are. So quite often we get theme parks and roller coasters in their island, but we also get some really interesting and realistic goals about how they'll generate energy, where they'll get their water from, where they need space to grow food. This task basically allows the children and young people to think much more strategically about their place and what they need from it and the needs of others in their lives as well. And this may also include things like redesigning or reusing what already exists in their neighbourhood or creating new facilities and services. And again, as I said, this is a really open task and allows for that creative expression for the children and young people's placemaking ideas. We then support the children and young people to feed back on their island maps to each other and us, and we'll list the key themes and attributes of each. Next slide, please. And from this, we then debate our final set of priorities, and this is the final stage of co-creating the plan with the children and young people. So to do this, we advise that the children and young people that their neighbourhood islands are now connected back to the rest of the world, and we take their lists of key themes and attributes identified during the island task and contrast these against the priorities already identified. And this allows us to add any additional or new priorities to create a full and finalised version of the plan. This stage can take quite a bit of time, as it leads to some debates about the necessities of some facilities and ideas and principles that each of them have come up with. But it's really, really important to give space to these discussions and ideas until a consensus between them is achieved. Sometimes a way of doing this is by ranking the priorities from most important to least important, so that if there's not total consensus about something being there, at least there's a place for it. And at that stage, once we've reached the end of that task, then we draw the engagement to a close and we thank all the children and young people for all of their efforts. This is a really rigorous process, and they will be quite tired at the end of it. It is an incredible amount of work that they do, but it is a really enjoyable engagement to undertake. Next slide, please. And the final output will be the children and young people's plan. And as you can see here, we have the map that they designed their tour on earlier, and you can see the route that they took there in black outline. And it's also surrounded by the photos that they took on their walk and identified as being the kind of things that were most important to them. You can also see there's post-its all over the map as well, and this is just the information that the facilitators capture while they're listening to the children and young people. And green is the things that are good, pink are the things that are not so good, and orange is what they'd like to change. And it's really useful having a really quick snapshot of gauging how young people feel about their area. So this is Langley's in Falkirk, and you can see this was the primary school. And you can see that they have kind of mixed feelings about their area. There's a lot of things they like, but there's also quite a few pink post-its and orange ones showing that there is things that need to be worked on and changed. And also the post-its give that little bit of extra detail and information about the issues that are specifically important to the children and young people. And then over on the right is the list of priorities which were identified and refined. And for example, in Langley's, they identified things like a teenage hangout space as being really important, improving safety in the area as well, and improving environmental quality with regards to like litter and things like that. So I'll pass back over to Jenny just now to advise on the next steps to follow during the plan creation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Anna. So we're now looking at kind of the supplementary phases that you could add if you wanted to extend a project. So this area is called developing our local projects. And what you can see on the screen is examples of where we did this in Inverurie in Aberdeenshire. And this was part of a project extension where we were creating just transition projects, because this was feeding into a much wider look at how the northeast of Scotland can become more sustainable and kind of embrace the just transition. So what we do to come up with local projects is we're usually going back at a different day after they've already done kind of all of this other stuff. So we kind of refresh their memories with the priorities for action that they came up with. And then what we do is give everyone like post-it notes, maybe 1 to 3, and we ask them to write their names on those post-it notes, and then they can go up to see the priorities kind of up at the front of the room, and they essentially just vote on the ones that they'd want to spend a bit more time working up some ideas from. And once they've cast their votes, we can see which areas they'd like to focus on, and we can organise groups of children and young people based on their interest. Sometimes they'll say they want to work by themselves or in pairs, and sometimes there's multiple groups that want to look at the same thing. So we just keep it flexible and fun in that way. And then we ask them just to express themselves either through writing or drawing or a mixture, to answer kind of some simple questions about basically what is it that they want to make happen, where or how do they think it could happen, and why it's important. So when they do this, it gives them an opportunity to really show us and to show other adults and other people the areas that they would really want to focus down on if they had the option, and also how they might be involved in that process going forward. Because another key thing is that children and young people don't just want to, in general, they don't just want to have adults go and do the things that they say are important. They often really want to be part of that process of change and actually feel a big part of their community. So a lot of the things they come up with are actually kind of community wide and not usually just actually for their group, which is really, really interesting. Next slide, please. So the next thing that you can do is to consult on their plan. So that could be that you've done the local projects aspect or not. You could consult on any aspect that the children and young people have already come up with. And there's a couple of ways that we found tends to work well in the schools to do this. And the main way is that if some of the children and young people that were initially involved, we tend to work with, say, 25-ish at times, sometimes a bit more, sometimes a bit less. And then there's often like a few representatives from that group that are really into the project and would like to share it with their peers. And so they can share it at assemblies or go around classrooms to kind of talk about the work they've done. And ask if other people's have things that they want to add to it or things that they object to within it. And also in a secondary school context, we find that it can work quite well to have an online survey. So we pull it into a survey that we give to them, and then they have a QR code. So young people kind of with their phone, they can log on to that and they can answer questions, quite simple questions like, is there anything you strongly don't agree with us including, or something very important that we've missed? And then that gives us an opportunity to kind of build a consensus view of what they want. So it's not about, do they agree with absolutely every point in the plan, because that's kind of unrealistic. It's really more, would you have a problem if these things happened in your community? And sometimes there are really good reasons that that would be a problem, and we can factor that into kind of what we put forward. But often it's just more that, you know, someone actually wouldn't go and use that use, but it's not going to affect their human rights or their enjoyment of their space. They just like to add something else to the plan. So once we've got this information, we can add those additions and corrections into the final plan. And we had one really, really successful response of this in Inverurie, which is why we're highlighting this one, but they had over 450 pupils give responses on their neighbourhood plan, and that's getting on for 50% of the school. And they also went and held focus groups with their neighbouring additional support needs school so that they could understand what they would want to add to the plan. And it really gave those young people an opportunity to think about all kind of sides of their place and how they could cater to everyone in the community. And when we went back to them, we could see that that had actually really influenced what they wanted to have in their plan. And it also really gave them confidence that they could speak on behalf of all of their peers in taking this forward. So next slide, please. So the final part of the programme of kind of activities that we think is a really good thing to do, and again, you don't have to have done the previous 2 steps to do this. You could just do the steps that Anna spoke about. But this showcasing our plan element is a way to kind of bring people together around the children and young people's plans, to think about next steps and to build legacy into it all. So what we tend to do, and this is what we did in Anna's project, is we work with one high school, and then we work with a couple or 2 or 3 kind of primary schools within the same catchment area. So they're all looking at the same place and they've all got something in common. So then we can bring representatives from those groups together, say about 5, you can have slightly more in their secondary age. And the first part of the morning, or the afternoon is for them to speak to each other about their plans. They're like young consultants. They have their posters, they have their priorities, they might have projects that they've created, and they tell one another, and then we can have a discussion about what they have in common, if there's things that are different about their plans. And sometimes just from that discussion, new things emerge as well. For instance, it might be that the older young people actually really want to work with the children on something. So that's really nice to see as well. And the older children also often tend to give the younger ones a bit more confidence, which really makes the day fantastic. And then after we've kind of had that briefing session where they've had a chance to prepare a bit, we invite some adults in, and we pick the adults to come based on what the young people are interested in. So they're all able to kind of respond in some way to the plans. And what we do is organize like a World Cafe. So it's a child and youth centered space where they kind of set the rules and they set the agenda on their tables, and it's the adults that move around and hear from the young people, and kind of can respond to whether or not there's things that they can do based on their plan, things that might be really difficult to do. So this is all part of kind of helping to manage expectations, but also not shutting down what possibilities might be there. And sometimes hearing kind of the strength of feeling from the children and young people on certain things can be really helpful for making their case. And it's also quite good. We find that many adults aren't used to speaking directly to children and young people. So this also gives them a safe space to have those interactions, and often to see that it's not really that scary. But I think quite often, because we're so separated in generations, that people don't get that much mixing opportunity. So we can invite like counsellors along to this, council officers, community groups, and public health. We've had the police at these workshops, and the children and young people tend to really benefit and enjoy having those kind of open and honest and frank conversations, because what we also often hear on one side from adults is that children and young people don't understand the constraints of the system, but what we hear from young people is that they know that there are constraints, but they don't know what they are. So until they know what they are, they can't respond to them. And when they do know them, they actually tend to respond really well, because we've had situations where they hear, you know, a skate park could take 5 years to build, and they go, oh, okay, right, maybe that's not the thing we want to focus on like right now. Could we focus on this instead? And so it's really about having that kind of trustful and open dialogue that helps them really understand how change can happen and the different kinds of timeframes that might work in, and ways that we might work together in future. Okay, next slide, please. So that's obviously quite a lot of information, and there's quite a lot of different elements of that process that could be done kind of in isolation, or could be done as kind of one big thing. And so what we've done is create a how-to guide based on this methodology. So this gives all of the details on how to co-create these neighbourhood and place plans with children and teenagers, and integrate their views into broader decision-making frameworks. So as I said at the start, this has been informed by this project, but also what we've done before. So it's got a number of different case studies in it as well that can show how this can work in different contexts. You know, what to do if the weather is really terrible that day, and what to do if you end up in a debate with children and young people where you're really getting too much into the minutiae and you need to move it on. And also just kind of tips about how you can work with children and young people, and the sort of things that won't work so well if that's what you try to do. And the audience is really anyone that's seeking to co-design and create place or neighbourhood plans for children and young people. So it could be council officers, but it could also be community groups, or like community councils looking to do a local place plan in Scotland, or a neighbourhood plan in England. And so we're going to drop this into the chat for anyone that kind of wants to look at it. And obviously we'd be very happy to talk about this more in the Q&A, or if you wanted to get in contact to talk about how you might use the guide, or we could support you to use these methods in future. Next slide, please. So that's everything for now. You can see our emails up on the screen if that's helpful. And thank you very much for listening to our talk just then.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Jenny and Anna. I think Peter's just stepped out, but he'll be back in a moment. So I'll start with a question. We've got a whole bunch of questions in the Q&A, and also just some other things that have come up through the presentations as well. I think one of the really interesting things for us sitting, or for most of us probably sitting in England and not in Scotland, is the difference in the potential sort of legislation and the direction of travel at a policy and government level around some of this. So I was just wondering if you think that the policy context in Scotland is helping, and what about that is helping in this sort of work and thinking about 20-minute neighbourhoods, thinking about children and young people. So what is it that's working that we might want to sort of try and embed in the English system, for example?
Yeah, so I mean, we're really lucky in Scotland in that we have things like 20-minute neighbourhoods embedded. We have new principles around providing for play, place efficiency assessments, like a statutory right for children to be engaged in local development plans. And we also have just had the incorporation of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child into Scots law. So that's some really great stuff that obviously really supports the case that we have to be doing things with children's rights in our practice, and this is definitely increasing kind of interest in this kind of work. I'd say that we're still kind of quite early days. So whilst we have fantastic policy in Scotland, I wouldn't necessarily say we have implementation that is any better than England and you know, Wales, of course, also has some really great legislation and policy around public health and children's rights and planning for future generations. So yeah, it's a bit of a shame that the direction of travel in English policy isn't as clear kind of in this direction. But I have seen, you know, plenty of case studies of things happening in England that are actually, you know, look quite positive. So things that sort of ZCD architects have done and things like that, and some great toolkits and things. And I wouldn't yet say that in Scotland we've got any great examples of implementation. Not to say that there wouldn't be some, but we're still quite early doors as well. So I think this kind of whole area is something that planners are just getting the opportunity to really think about. So it's quite exciting everywhere, even if the policy isn't as good as we would like it to be.
Yeah, and yeah, maybe you can trailblaze a few things and we'll catch up. And certainly at our conference in June, we hope to sort of share some of the work that's going on sort of in spite of the system that we have. Peter, there was quite a lot of chat around your talk, but actually where. So where can people look for some of the examples of where this has been done, you know, successfully or unsuccessfully, but you know, where should people be looking for some examples and case studies of your work in the UK?
Yeah, so I guess the first thing is if people would like kind of more detail about some of the case studies, that's contained in some of our papers, and I'm happy to share those, and happy for my contact details to be shared so that people can request those if they like. The one kind of case study that we often talk about is Upton, which is on the southwestern edge of Northampton in the English Midlands, which for some years in the 2000s was kind of vaunted as an exemplar for sustainable urban design, particularly for a sustainable urban extension. And that was really one of the sites that we had in mind when we were talking about young people's experiences of moving quite intensively around their communities, even if they didn't have that kind of greater spatial range that I mentioned. And where there were kind of various aspects of the urban environment that both facilitated their movement and their play, from street design to green spaces to blue spaces, but also caused some of the tensions and problems that I identified. So certainly Upton in Northamptonshire is a good example. In terms of teenagers, because I think I saw there was a question specifically about teenagers, this kind of brings us on to, I think, some of the debates about planning spaces for different ages, but where children and young people are at the forefront. And there are several good examples that spring to my mind from around the world, which I often also share with our students here. There's the Fremantle Esplanade Youth Plaza in Australia, which was co-designed by young people and city authorities, and is often seen as a really good kind of example of kind of co-design for older young people as well as for children. There's Rabalder Park in Roskilde in Denmark, which ostensibly is a great big skate park, but it's also used as a way of dealing with runoff from excessive rainfall and has a number of other kind of facilities inbuilt. So it's not the kind of classic, let's build a space for young people, let's build a skate park. It goes beyond that to be a more inclusive kind of environment. The other thing I'd say is there are lots of good resources that exist beyond kind of examples I can sort of pluck that I know on, for instance, the Child in the City website. And great to see that Tim Gill will be presenting at the conference in Birmingham. So his books have a number of really great examples that kind of cite examples for older young people as well as for younger children. So lots of resources out there, and I think there's a real gathering of kind of interests and examples coming together.
So just to follow up on that slightly, so what do you think for say Upton what's the enabling factor there that makes it a good example?
Yeah, well, I mean, I talked about the disadvantages of the shared surfaces, but there were also advantages to them as well. There was that kind of cue and signal that space was a space for pedestrians, not only for children and young people. I think the kind of the nature of the design, and here we get into kind of sort of psychology, environmental psychology, and kind of nudge design, is that the community was, as I understand it, built in such a way that people would kind of bump into each other accidentally but on purpose. So lots of attempts to have kind of congruences between roads and streets, to have little squares, for instance. So opportunities where people were moving to actually bump into each other. And children and young people told us that facilitated not only them moving around, but coming across other groups of children and young people, also other groups of adults as well, which was important. But it was kind of self-perpetuating because, of course, as we all know, it's not just about the design, and children and young people's presence in the streets, they're being there and welcoming new families when they moved in. They're using spaces also could then was facilitative and kind of created a sense of vibrancy, which then encouraged further use. So it's that kind of complex interplay of the kind of planned features and the kind of social aspects.
And do you think that was driven by the developer or driven by like a design guidance from the local authority, or both?
I think a mix. I mean, as with a number of kind of contemporary sites, a very complex kind of mix of stakeholders involved in the design. So I think it was all of those things. Certain parts of the development I think worked better than others. There were different developers involved in different parts of the development too. But also, I mean, there was also happenstance. So there were certain areas that were raised for building, and then we had the global financial crisis back in 2009. It took a very long time for some of those sites to be built on. So we kind of had the classic going back to Colin Ward's work, the classic kind of wasteland spaces which children and young people began to use for biking, for exploring, for hanging out. So there's a bit of that kind of increasingly familiar debate around temporary uses and meanwhile uses, which was also a really important aspect. So yes, the planned bits, but also the unplanned happenstance, which could perhaps form parts of planning for these kinds of places in the future.
Yeah. There are a few sort of comments and questions in the chat around sort of variety within children's voices, thinking about the different needs of different groups potentially, and the danger of sort of lumping children and young people into one. So I was wondering if anyone had any reflections on the challenges and opportunities of thinking about how you include a variety of voices, and the sort of the different power structures between groups as well.
Yeah, I mean, well, I can start if that's helpful. Yeah, I mean, it's really good to work with a diverse group of young people, like without a doubt. That is kind of what you need. You need different views and perspectives highlighted. And often when we're doing our projects, we'll work with a mix of different ages. And we'll also, like a lot of our work is in schools, but not all of it is in schools. But when we are in schools, the lead that we try to give to teachers, obviously if it's a primary school, we work with everyone, and then it's just inherently involves everyone within a class. But when it comes to secondary schools, we ask that we could have the young people that maybe wouldn't necessarily see themselves as someone that would sign up for this kind of project, but that probably would really benefit from it. So we try to get that mix as far as we can. And we also just really highlight to the schools that, look, we're not looking for your academic pupils that are going to tell us everything is great. That's not the purpose of the project. What we actually want to do is to challenge policy and action to serve the needs of those like communities that aren't so served. So that's also, it's another reason why a lot of our work at APIC, we try to focus on areas that aren't getting a lot of investment and where young people's lives probably are harder, because that's where we can actually kind of achieve the greatest impact. So it's a big focus of what we try to do. And when there are kind of youth groups and things we can go to, we also often try to do that, but there's not a lot of youth groups these days. So that can be a bit of a challenge. There's not a lot of places to go for young people that feel really kind of excluded from the system. So that's kind of a real challenge. And I think in that case, there are, if you're lucky, there are kind of youth workers or community development workers that actually do have the trust of those young people. And then it's really great to work through them. So hopefully that's kind of a bit of an insight into how you can do it. But I do think just in general, while schools won't include absolutely everybody, there's something really powerful about working with schools, because it's kind of one of the only situations, I think, as a planner where your entire community, you know exactly where they are, it's place-based, and where else can you spend like a focused 6 hours with one continuous group to really delve into issues together, and where also, to be honest, it's probably going to be more fun for them than a lot of the subjects they have on that day. Even if it's not their favorite thing, a lot of them would rather be doing this and going out and doing walks and taking photos than they would be doing maths. So it's quite a good way to actually really delve deeper into the issues. And I mean, we only work with children and young people unless the adults are kind of working with the children and young people. But, you know, what I hear quite a lot from planners is that that kind of diversity is really difficult to get in the adult population. So I think investing the time in schools is actually really powerful for getting that view.
Thank you. Did you want to add something, Peter?
That's okay. Yeah, do we have time
Yeah.
for me to add? Yeah, I mean, I won't repeat anything Jenny said, because I absolutely agree. But to pick up on something I think that probably comes across both of the sets of talks, one important thing is also the kind of range of methods that we're using between us. You know, dozens of methods across all of our different projects that you've heard about today, and that's of course important in engaging different ages of children and young people with different capacities, different interests, those who learn in different ways, and so on. So I think actually the range of methods is as important as where you're doing the work. And that's meant that we've also been able to work directly with special educational needs schools, for instance, who've been involved in some of the work we've done with local authorities, and coming into direct dialogue with planners. The other thing I think I'd urge, I think Jenny, you're kind of getting at this, is the kind of what we want to try and get away from what we've called in a recent paper the good research child. So the child who tells us what we want to hear, answers all the questions, does so in a way that's understandable to adults. But how do we deal with those children who do challenge, who perhaps present their ideas in a different way, which could be really, really important and really valuable, but gets sometimes dismissed because it's not in the frame that we would like it to be? And I guess the third thing is, and this is not the answer or the panacea, but using young people as researchers. So we work with young people as peer researchers. Particularly recently, we've been working with Birmingham City Council's Young Voices team. And that can also be a way of thinking about how we can work with quite diverse groups of young people out of school settings where appropriate.
Great. Anna, I might pick on you, but in terms of the neighbourhood plans and moving forward, have you had interest in them from local planning authorities and sort of built environment specialists?
Yeah, so it's been really, really interesting because each of the councils, as Jenny implied in the talk, then each of the councils has approached the plans from a different perspective. So, for example, in Aberdeenshire, it was actually community development that took the plans forward rather than planning, but they're working closely with planning, but also their colleagues across the council. So they've really been able to embed the plan in lots of different policy frameworks and areas to inform their next steps and also their ongoing communications, both with the community and with the children and young people who created them. So that's been really, really interesting. And another example is Shetland. Then the area covered in Shetland, it was more of a place plan rather than a specific neighbourhood plan, by virtue that it's an island and it's also a really large area. There's children are spread out across like 50 square miles rather than 4. But we weren't able to include a school and we weren't able to include teenagers in that plan. So they've invited us back to expand the plan and expand the scope of their West Side plan, just so that they can use it as a basis for their local place plan. We're still working with Scottish Borders to kind of create their legacy of how they can take their plan forward and embed it into their decision making, but they will be using it as part of their evidence base for their new local development plan. And also it's being used by the Towns team, which is their local place planning team run by the community. And most excitingly is that we've received further funding for phase 2 of this project, and that would be working with Falkirk Council to run a community festival to showcase the children's ideas to the broader community and work with the existing community groups to try and make action on the ground happen. Again, in fact, that area had real issues with kind of environmental quality and also some issues with regards to safety. So it's working with both, providing that link with the council and the local community, but based on the perspective of children and young people to make that happen. And also return that pride of place back to them, because that's one thing we do hear a lot, even in the more disadvantaged areas, is that there is a real pride of place about where they're from, but they really feel that people don't see that, and they feel that neglect more broadly, even from really young ages. And we're also doing a similar project in Edinburgh as well, about realising some of the ambitions that the children and young people had in Craigmillar about public art and teenage hangout spaces. So we received funding from them to commission public art and design that with the children and young people to reclaim some of the areas that have been, I guess, more neglected just from long-term lack of investment, and bring those back into use. So there is a lot of interest and a lot of ambition. And I think these plans are very much, we see them as the start for people. So yeah, it's very, very exciting. And we really, really hope that they kind of ignite more interest from other councils and other places wanting to do it, to see that it can happen.
Yeah, and absolutely, just like 20-minute neighbourhoods, actually, it's planning, but it's so much more than planning, and it's this whole sort of place shaping and place making agenda, which involves so many different groups of people within the local authority and actually outside of the local authority as well. So it completely makes sense that planning is one strand of that. Interestingly, though, on planning, there is a question around that planning is increasingly sort of being driven by targets and metrics. So, biodiversity net gain or housing delivery targets. So can you think of or imagine like a headline indicator that might be used to benchmark or improve planning outcomes for children and young people? That's it's quite a tricky question, but if we had to try and imagine how to do it, what indicator or indicators might we look at?
And I have a couple of ideas. The first would be that if you've done some kind of plan with children and young people, what have you delivered on it? So I think that would be a good way to see if the children and young people's ideas are actually having an impact. And I think the other thing would be, so in the context of Scotland and Wales, we have place efficiency assessments. And I know that there's a lot of people that would like to bring those in England as well. And I know some areas are doing it anyway, even though it's not a statutory thing. But that's a really good measure. If you can do that properly, like what is children's idea of sufficiency? Are you providing sufficient environments for them? Because that the interpretation of play, it's not just like little children and play parks. It's really a wider interpretation of, do children and young people get to use their public realm in the way that they would want to? And the best measure of that is, do the children and young people think it's good enough? So in an ideal world, that would be the benchmark, I think.
Yeah. Yes, and I know that one of our attendees from Play England has put in the link around the ask for that in England in terms of a place efficiency piece of legislation, so people can follow that up if they wish to. Did anyone else want to come in on that? Just a nice hard question for when Thursday afternoon. Nope. Okay. So let me just have a think. I think we're sort of coming probably into the end a little bit. There's always a question of whose job is this? Where does the funding come from? How do we try and, in the absence of a statutory requirement, how do we gather the motivation and the interest in things like this? And I wondered if you had any thoughts on that at all.
I could answer from the Scottish perspective.
Mm-hmm.
I guess that is one benefit that we have got under the new Planning Act in Scotland, is that children and young people have to be consulted on their local development plan, which does provide a lot of leverage for the councils to go out and do this work. But I think there is that gap in that planning is really, really under-resourced, and it is really difficult for people to find the time to get out there and do this work. However, the training, upskilling to be able to go out and get this information to inform the local development plan and bring everyone on that journey with them is a really big opportunity. So there is that hook there. I'm not sure if there's another one, Jenny.
I mean, I was going to say, I'm not saying that this is an easy argument, but I think when there isn't a statutory duty, it's just efficient and effective to actually ask children and young people, because they're good at talking about their place. They spend loads of time in it. They don't just get in a car and leave it. So they really understand it. So if we invest time in understanding the place from their perspective, we'll go a long way to kind of knowing what the wider community thinks. And it's also often quite a good springboard once you've got what the children think for the adults to respond to it. And also often what we get is adults kind of just saying, they've kind of done it. Like, I wouldn't have expected them to have known this much, but actually they're really, really knowledgeable. So, and I think also if whoever you're speaking to is open to the longer term argument, it's just these young people are going to benefit or not benefit from the decisions we make now. So if there's one group that we invest time in, it should really be them.
Jenny, I just have one more thought and question probably before we wrap up, but Peter, it was really interesting in your presentation, that link between sustainable development and net zero, and actually these sort of parallel agendas that we're all sort of thinking about and working on, and the links between them. And I wondered how important you think it is that we make sure we make the links across to things like net zero and the sustainability sort of climate change angles.
Well, I guess firstly, it's really important to children and young people themselves, and we know that there's established evidence to show that, and that comes out particularly through the kinds of activism that I mentioned earlier, but in a whole range of other ways too. So that's one aspect. I think the second thing, and something we're exploring, is that these are really complex and often compound issues and challenges that we're facing. So, for instance, the ways in which challenges experienced during COVID have or haven't continued, but intersected with a cost of living crisis, which isn't only about the availability of food in certain countries or geopolitics, it's also about the environment. These are really complex compound issues. So it's about trying to find, for us as researchers, methods and approaches to understanding those and to understanding how they impact on children's lives, but then trying to find clear ways to communicate that complexity when it comes to the planning of places. And I think what we also find is that when it comes to things like air quality, for instance, the sort of urban heat island effect, the quality of the urban environment in a more subjective sense, and also children's physical activity, those things can align. They're not necessarily incommensurate. There are ways in which we can create places where all of those things align, whether we start from a kind of healthy places perspective or a physical activity perspective or from a sustainability perspective. So I think it's important to note that we're kind of hopefully all working towards the same sort of agenda in doing that rather than conflicting.
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly the 20-minute neighbourhood model or the 50-minute cities module absolutely is about places for everyone and thinking about children and young people as in the round. There was also a comment about the place standard tool, a question. I don't know if you used it in your work, Jenny or Anna, but certainly it's there in existence for people, and there is a children and young people's version which is worth a look.
Yes, I was just going to say we helped develop that children and young people's version with children and young people. So a lot of the methods that me and Anna use, like the walkabouts and developing priorities for action, that was kind of what we used to help develop the tool. And that's a really good, the kind of front end to do before using the tool, if that's something you want to do.
Yeah, brilliant. And again, it's a free resource that people can go and look at, and there are how to use it guides and things like that. So absolutely brilliant for if you're doing design codes or neighbourhood plans and all of those sorts of things as well, so as something you can pick up off the shelf and apply. Brilliant, thank you so much. I think we will just sort of leave it there a couple of minutes early because we were down on one speaker, but that last slide has on our information about the TCPS website, how to follow us on social media, my email address, and also a QR code to sign up for our newsletter if you want to receive regular updates about what we're up to as an organisation. So just to say thank you ever so much to all of our speakers, and thank you again to Sport England for sponsoring the webinar. And yeah, we will be back in this space fairly soon again, I'm sure, and certainly look forward to seeing some of you at conference in June. So thanks very much, everybody, and have a good afternoon.